The meeting will come to order. I note that a quorum is present and that each member has before them copies of the material on our agenda today at their place at the rostrum. The bill 4413 is now before the committee for consideration, and without objection, the first reading of the bill will be waived and it will be open for amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Thank you for being here today to consider H.R. 4413, the Customer Protection and End User Relief Act. This is a bipartisan bill that I introduced along with my colleagues on the committee to reauthorize the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. The multi-year process of reauthorizing the CFTC gave the committee an opportunity to review the agency's operations, examine the pressing issues facing the futures and derivatives markets, evaluate how regulations are impacting end users and the agricultural community, and determine how best to protect customer funds while helping restore confidence in our markets. This process has also allowed the committee to take stock of past events, such as the passage of Dodd-Frank Act of 2010, the ensuing rulemaking process, and the failures of MF Global and PFG Best. It's impossible to consider reauthorizing CFTC and the future of the CFTC without recognizing the impact of these events on the agency and its response to them. H.R. 4413 addresses some of the concerns we've heard over the past couple of years from a variety of stakeholders, especially our agricultural producers and end users. Our efforts will increase certainty in the marketplace, improve customer protections, and provide a more balanced approach to regulations impacting job creators. I appreciate the work of my colleagues who helped in this legislation, and I ask you to join me in supporting it. I now recognize the ranking member for an opening statement on this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for your hard work, and along with Subcommittee Chairman Conaway and Ranking Member Scott. The Ag Committee is demonstrating once again that we can produce bipartisan legislation. As people know, I'm not a big fan of regulations. I'd like to let the marketplace sort things out generally, but after the financial collapse, it became clear that we needed to do something to rein in some of this risky behavior and bring some marketplace transparency. And additionally, the failures of MF Global and Peregrine Financial had shown that more could be done. So this legislation addresses these cases along with some of the concerns that have arisen during implementation of Dodd-Frank. H.R. 4413 also builds on the committee's previous bipartisan actions to further clarify that end users who were not responsible for the financial collapse should not unnecessarily be burdened by new financial regulations. While the rulemaking process has been confusing and longer than I would have liked, there is no reason that I can see to dismantle Dodd-Frank, and as some in Congress have suggested. And I believe that H.R. 4413 is reasonable legislation that ensures a well-functioning CFTC, regulates financial entities dealing in the swaps market, and allows end users to continue using derivatives to hedge risk associated with their underlying business. As you know, Mr. Chairman, this legislation has been a collaborative process, and I'd like to recognize many of our committee Democrats who worked with Republicans on different bills that have been incorporated. Ranking Member Scott, Mr. Costa, Garamendi, Ms. Fudge, Mr. Vela, Mr. Gallego, Mr. Varga, and Mr. Maloney, who all worked on legislation that's been incorporated in this bill. So I'm proud that once again the Ag Committee is demonstrating to the rest of Congress that it's possible to do legislation in a bipartisan way, and if others followed our model, we'd get a lot more accomplished in this Congress. So with that, I urge my colleagues to support this legislation and yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his insights, and I now recognize the subcommittee chairman of the primary subcommittee on this issue, Mr. Conaway of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and Ranking Member Peterson both for the bipartisan and constructive tone that you set for our committee throughout our work. It's reflected in the bill that's before us today. Over the past 2 years, the General Farm Commodities and Risk Management Subcommittee has heard from 2 commissioners, the exchanges, SROs, market participants, end users, and foreign regulators on a broad cross-section of issues facing the CFTC. The testimony and questions that we heard form the foundation of what has become the Consumer Protection and End Users Relief Act. True to its name, the Consumer Protection and End Users Relief Act makes important progress in protecting Main Street. We strengthen safeguards against another MF Global or PFG Best and significantly reduce the damage a failed FCM can inflict on its customers. We also protect end users from being roped into reporting, registration, and regulatory requirements that are inappropriate for the level of risk that they can impose on the financial markets. It's clear that end users did not cause the financial crisis in 2008. They do not pose a systemic risk to the U.S. financial markets, and they should not be treated as financial entities. At the Commission, one of the most important changes we make is to finally require a meaningful quantification of the costs and benefits of a rule when it is first proposed. This change will strengthen the rulemaking process and will result in better rules and a safer market. This small mandate on the economists at the CFTC will ensure that regulatory burdens are justified in the real world, not just in the pages of the Financial Register. As Mr. Peterson said on Monday, the bill before us isn't perfect. No bill is. But it's a bill I'm proud of and proud to have my name on. We protect customers and end users from overreach and make meaningful changes to the operations of the Commission that will result in a stronger CFTC and stronger oversight of the financial markets. As I close, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Ranking Member Scott, who's been a true partner as we've examined these CFTC issues. Together, we introduced legislation, held hearings, and conducted oversight in a bipartisan manner, and I'm pleased with the fruits of our labor in the subcommittee. Of course, nothing we do today would be possible without our staff and their tireless work on behalf of each of us. As usual, their late nights have made us look good this morning. So one final thank you to the committee and personal office staffs. Your work is deeply appreciated. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back and I urge my colleagues to support the Consumer Protection and End-User Relief Act.
Gentleman that yields back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, once again of the primary subcommittee, the gentleman from Georgia, David Scott, for his remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you, and I want to thank Ranking Member Peterson, Subcommittee Chairman Conway for his excellent leadership on the bill. As he mentioned, we worked on this bill. We had 4 hearings, I believe, in our subcommittee. We heard from everybody, and I think we have together put a well-crafted, bipartisan bill that will continue the CFTC's critical mission of protecting market participants and the public from fraud. I think also I might add, Mr. Chairman, that, of course, as you know, I've been very, very much concerned about making sure we get the CFTC the adequate funding and resources they need. As you know, Dodd-Frank, and it's particularly Section 7 of Dodd-Frank, has put a tremendous amount of responsibility and administrative as well as investigative and enforcement powers within the CFTC, and certainly we want to continue as we move forward to keep an eye on and make sure that they have the funding as we move forward over the 5-year period. The bill certainly helps protect customers. It gives the CFTC the administrative and enforcement power it needs. And most importantly, it gives our end users some relief. So H.R. 4413 in its current form will continue to protect our financial industry. It's a good bill, and I urge my colleagues to support this bill as we have it today. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair would note, do any members have remarks on the underlying bill? Seeing none. The bill is now open for amendment. Does any member have amendments to the bill H.R. 4413?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment. Distribute the amendment. I should also note, while the clerk's distributing the amendment, would the gentleman like to proceed with his explanation?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your leadership in bringing the Customer Protection and End User Relief Act before the committee. It is important work, and this is a good bill that helps to address a lot of the issues our end users have experienced. However, I rise to offer an amendment on an issue that this committee has yet to examine. As chairman of the Judiciary Committee and as a member representing a district whose manufacturing sector depends on aluminum, I have been looking into concerns about the supply of aluminum. Many end users contend that the supply of aluminum has been put in jeopardy as a result of restrictive policies and procedures by the London Metal Exchange, or LME, its trading members, and LME-sanctioned warehouses. Unlike practices on the CME, where delivery of physical commodities happens in days, metals exchanged on the LME allow warehouses to hold metals for long periods of time. Currently, metals are being held for over 600 days in warehouses, while the warehouses charge purchasers rent on the metal. I am greatly concerned that these warehousing practices may be driving up the price of aluminum. In order to ensure a strong manufacturing sector, we must ensure the integrity of the U.S. market for aluminum. The CFTC is charged with the responsibility to prevent illegal price manipulation and unfair trading. The CFTC acknowledges that they have the authority to regulate and investigate the concerns about the aluminum supply. However, end users are concerned that the CFTC has been slow to take action and look into their concerns. The amendment I am offering today is very simple but fair. It would simply require the CFTC to report annually to Congress on what actions they are taking or plan to take to ensure a stable marketplace for aluminum. End users should be confident that the CFTC is addressing the concerns they raise. Mr. Chairman, this is an issue that affects many of our constituents and the U.S. manufacturing sector. Record amounts of aluminum are in storage, yet prices are at an all-time high, which is completely inconsistent with traditional supply and demand theory. Mr. Chairman, as the committee charged with ensuring the oversight of our commodity markets, it's our duty to ensure that these markets are functioning properly. Given the concerns raised, I think the committee should begin to examine this issue. Mr. Chairman, with your agreement to continue working to address the aluminum end users' concern, it's my intention to withdraw this amendment. It's my understanding there may be some other members who wish to speak to it as well. At the appropriate time, I will withdraw it. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there members who would additionally seek time on this amendment? The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 5 minutes.
I'd just like to ask the sponsor of the amendment a question for clarification. Did I understand you right? You know, on the other commodity contracts, there's delivery dates and close to the contracts. Are you saying on aluminum that a purchaser will buy aluminum and there's no part of the contract that says it has to be closed in a certain amount of time or delivery has to take place?
For aluminum delivered from these warehouses, it's averaging 600 days, and the purchaser pays rent on it while it's sitting in the warehouse.
So what we really need to do in the law is to have contract closing dates like we do on all the other commodities.
I'm not sure yet what the solution is, but it does not appear appropriate to have aluminum stored for such long periods of time and in such large quantities when the price is as high as it is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Any additional anyone seeking additional recognition? If not, then I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Clearly, the gentleman has brought to the attention of the committee an issue that he's concerned about and that needs to be examined. I think in good faith we can proceed in that spirit, and I would yield to the gentleman if he's prepared to withdraw his amendment.
I thank the chairman, and on that basis, I look forward to working with him and other members of the committee on this issue, and I will withdraw the amendment at this time.
I thank the gentleman for that. Does any member have an additional amendment to the bill, H.R. 4413?
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Would the clerk distribute the amendment from the gentleman from Texas? And the gentleman may proceed when he's prepared.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pretty straightforward suggestion or amendment, and that would be that as each new rule at the CFTC is issued, that it would have a sunset date of attached to the rule that would require the rule to go away unless the Commission voted to maintain the rule. It's a good governance idea. It stems from an experience I had in Texas. When I was chairman of the State Board of Accountancy, our entire agency was sunsetted by existing Texas law. So we went through that process, and quite frankly, it was miserable. We had to look at every rule, every regulation we had. We cleaned out the dead wood. We had to justify positions that the agency had taken with respect to regulating the practice of public accountancy in Texas. But at the end of the day, we came out of it leaner, much better off. The industry, the profession itself was in better shape in terms of being regulated and had the oversight. Would not have happened had we not had a specific requirement that we go through it. So this is an idea that I would like to start the conversation on, and would welcome any of my my colleagues to comment as well. We've not had any hearings. We've not walked through all the ramifications, so I don't believe I'm prepared to vote on this today, so I'd intend to withdraw it. But I do want to start the conversation that somehow we get at this issue of holding executive branch agencies accountable for applying the laws with congressional intent, and this would be one way to get at that. Would be relatively benign that way to get. So I hope we can have some hearings on this in the future, but subject to my colleagues wanting to weigh in on it, I'm prepared to withdraw the amendment.
The gentleman yields back his time. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott.
I like Mr. Conway's suggestion. I would also suggest that at the state level, the Committee of Jurisdiction had the right to reject a rule that an agency had passed, and that might be something that we would look at as well as the ability to outright reject that rule.
The gentleman yields back. Anyone else seeking time on this? The gentleman from Iowa is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of this amendment, and it's consistent with the philosophy of a bill that I've introduced in the last three Congresses called the Sunset Act, which actually sunsets our rules incrementally over a period of time and asks Congress to review them. It gives us an opportunity to amend or strike certain rules. We, as Mr. Conway has pointed out, we get rules that are written and they live forever, and they're not re-examined, and their time has passed, or perhaps the politics of the situation has changed. So I think this philosophy that's in this amendment is consistent with what this Congress should be doing, moves us in the right direction. I urge its adoption. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition on this amendment? Seeing none. Up, down. Mr. Garamundi is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I suspect that were this to become law, the ultimate law of unintended consequences would very quickly find its way in. There are rules that any one of us might object to, but there's also rules that basically lay out the way in which the whole program operates. And the uncertainty that would be created by a pending termination of that or those rules that lay the foundation for the operation, in this case of the CFTC, could create chaos. So I would proceed with great caution here. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Anyone else seeking recognition on this? Seeing none, I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I congratulate the gentleman from Texas. I think looking at the prospect of bringing this kind of accountability to the federal rulemaking process has much merit. I agree that it's clearly in the early stages and that he has certainly laid down the mark. And with that, I would yield to him if he has a motion on his amendment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the comments for and also Gary Mindy's caution, and that's why I'm not going to ask for a vote today. And with that, I ask unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment.
The gentleman asked by unanimous consent the amendment be withdrawn. Seeing no objection, the amendment is withdrawn. Does any member have additional amendments to the bill 4413?
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes to present
I'd like to move to strike the last word.
The gentleman moves to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and the ranking member for working with me to include my provision regarding de minimis trading levels in the bill. I'm proud of the work we've done and glad to see it in the underlying bill. I thank you for that. I also want to raise an issue that I believe is important to the reforms we're seeking with this bill we're considering today. It's one that I hope we can address as our bill moves to the floor. Specifically, the issue I'm concerned about is ensuring that when the CFTC gathers highly sensitive proprietary information from business investing in or hedging the commodities market, the CFTC appropriately safeguards that confidential information. Regulators need data to make good policy decisions, Mr. Chairman. They're gathering tremendous volumes of data. But when market participants are afraid that their most sensitive trading strategies might leak out after they hand it over to the regulator, that's a real problem. I wish it were just a theoretical problem. Unfortunately, we've all heard stories of sensitive trading information that did, in fact, leak out of the CFTC. I believe we need language to strengthen the confidentiality protections in the current law for reports filed with the CFTC by those participants in the commodities markets. As my colleagues are aware, current protections are simply not as strong as the protections for similar reports filed by participants in the securities markets at the SEC, and we need to fix that. When highly sensitive data is handed over to these regulators, those businesses expect it to be treated with appropriate care. If the safeguards are ineffective and data leaks out, that undermines confidence in our markets. Mr. Chairman, I believe this is a bipartisan issue. I look forward to working with you and the ranking member on language between now and when this bill is brought to the floor that can bring the confidentiality protections for CFTC registered entities up to the same level as SEC registered entities. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back after making a very good point. Are there additional amendments to the bill, H.R. 4413?
Mr. Chairman, move to strike the last word.
Gentleman moves to strike the last word. And where is the gentleman? Yes. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to underscore on a bipartisan basis the statements and concerns of my colleague, Mr. Hudson. It's absolutely a reasonable expectation for folks who are trying to operate in complex and heavily regulated markets, like the derivatives markets, to expect that proprietary information be treated confidentially by the regulators. It engenders a more productive and cooperative working relationship and better regulation for everyone. It's an absolutely reasonable expectation and one that we recognize in the context of the SEC. And I'd just like to underscore from the other side of the aisle that Mr. Hudson's concerns are well placed, and I look forward to working with him and with you in the committee on that issue. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Nagelbauer.
to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I just want to also associate myself with Mr. Hudson and Mr. Maloney's remarks. I think we provide those protections with other agencies. And one of the things that's going on right now in this government is with Dodd-Frank and a lot of the new regulations is we're collecting a huge amount of data. And that was under the auspice that, of safety and soundness, but, and price discovery. But, I think we have to be very careful here and not to cause some of our companies to be disadvantaged because of the fact that some of this information is being not handled appropriately. So I hope that our committee would take action, and not later, but sooner, to bring some equity here between that and also to protect these companies, but at the same time collect enough data to meet the safety and soundness quotas. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Are there any additional amendments to 4413? Any additional amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Of course, the gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since being elected in Congress, our focus has been on jobs, jobs, jobs. One place we see expansion of jobs is with the IPOs. This is why I've zeroed in with 3 bills focused on the IPO process. I was pleased to work with and want to thank the chairman for working with me to include H.R. 4392, the Energize Emerging Opportunities Act, as a provision of H.R. 4413, Consumer Protection and End User Relief Act. My legislation, the Jumpstart Our Business Startup Act, known as the Jobs Act, passed by the House and the Senate and signed into law in 2012, directed the SEC to provide an exemption for general solicitation and marketing for companies. Historically, the CFTC and SEC have mirrored rules so investors have a clear understanding of what is allowed. My bill, the Energize Emerging Opportunities, is aimed at making sure that federal agencies have clarity in their rules. The Energize Emerging Opportunities Act simply corrects an oversight and clarifies the rule of general solicitation within the CFTC and SEC. CFTC regulations restrict commodity pool operators from providing information to the public about their funds. Since the Jobs Act was enacted into law in April 2012, 561 companies have gone public as emerging growth companies, which is 84% of all IPOs according to the SEC. IPOs are up 70% and are forecasted to hit their highest level in more than 10 years. EGCs have increased employment by 156% after their IPO. More public offerings mean more and more jobs. The Energize Emerging Opportunities Act will allow for more possibilities for companies to expand and grow. I want to thank the chairman again and look forward to working with the rest of the committee to pass this legislation. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Once again, are there additional amendments to the bill H.R. 4413? Additional amendments? Additional amendments? Additional amendments? Does the ranking member have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the bill H.R. 4413 be reported favorably to the House with the recommendation that it do pass.
The question is on the motion to favorably report H.R. 4413. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying aye. No. Yep. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do indeed have it. The yeas have it, and the bill H.R. 4413 is ordered to be reported favorably to the House of Representatives. Does any member give notice of intent to file supplemental, minority, or additional views on H.R. 4413? Without objection, the usual instructions are given to staff that consist of making such technical, clarifying, or confirming changes as are appropriate without changing the substance of the legislation. The meeting is now adjourned. Thank you.